Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Watson Institute. My name is Richard Locke. I am a professor of political science here and currently serve as the director of the Watson Institute. And it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you to this evening's event, which is a panel discussion of David Kertzer's book, The Pope and Mussolini. And what I thought I would do is maybe make just a few very brief introductory remarks, and then we'll start with our session. So let me begin by introducing David Kertzer. It's a terrific honor to be able to host this event here at Watson. David is a new colleague, but someone whose work I've known for a really long time and has been extremely helpful, at least to me, in my transition to Brown University. David is the Paul Dupuy University Professor of Social Science and Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies here at Brown University. He came to Brown in 1992, but before then taught at Bowdoin College. He has published, at least my count was 9 books and scores of articles and book chapters. And I first became familiar with David's work in the mid-1980s when I was a graduate student at MIT, and I read this terrific book, Comrades and Christians, that talked about these kind of subcultures that coexisted in a part of Terza Italia. And it very much shaped the way that I came to understand the role of these subcultures and how they shaped political, economic, and even social behavior. David has twice won the Mazzaro Prize for the Society for Italian Historical Studies, and his book, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, was a finalist for the National Book Award in 1997. His 2001 book, The Pope Against the Jews, has been published in 9 languages, and in 2005, David was elected as a fellow to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Aside from being a prodigious scholar, as is obvious, he also has, which I think he tries to hide these days, but he actually is very gifted administrator. David was a provost of Brown University from 2006 to 2011, and his most recent book, The Pope and Mussolini, is the focus of this evening's session. And those of you who had a chance to read it know that it's truly a fantastic book, just historically rich and incredibly well written. It's really almost like a detective story that is so captivating. And for me, it was actually especially interesting to read because it took me back to some of my childhood memories. My mother is Italian. I used to visit as a child my maternal grandparents, and my maternal grandfather was an Italian Jew who actually was a civil servant. He was a World War I decorated war hero who, during the fascist period, because of the embrace of Mussolini of these Aryan laws, had to basically he was kicked out of his job, had to go into hiding. My mother and her brother were sent into the countryside for a number of years during that period. And when I was a little kid and I would go to Rome and visit him, he was a big walker and a big talker, and we would walk around the streets of Rome, and during that period, he would never talk about his life as a civil servant, which he had actually regained after the war, or various things, but he would only talk about the different buildings that he had worked on when he was an informal bricklayer, a muratore, which is the only employment that he could have during that period when he was kicked out. And that's what he talked about. And reading David's book, it was interesting to see how complicitous the church was with the fascist regime in bringing about the the terrible and maybe less terrible things that happened in that period. So it was really very, very meaningful book for me. Let me just introduce also the panelists, and I'll go down the line because there's 2 Kevins on the panel. So our first Kevin is Professor Kevin Madigan, who is the Wynne Professor of Ecclesiastical History and the Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs at Harvard Divinity School. Kevin Madigan is a historian of medieval Christian religious practice and thought, and he's been at the Harvard Divinity School since 2000. He's the author of 5 books and numerous articles, including one on the Roman Catholic Church and the Nazi period. Next to him is Professor Suzanne Stewart Steinberg, who is a professor of comparative literature and Italian studies here at Brown. Suzanne works on Italian and German literature of the 19th and 20th centuries, psychoanalysis, and literary and cultural theory, with a particular interest in the construction of gender, notwithstanding having, as I just learned, a PhD in political science from Yale. So we're going to sort of bring you closer into the fold. Suzanne has published several books and numerous articles, including most recently Impious Fidelity, Anna Freud, Psychoanalysis, and Politics. And she has recently been appointed the director of the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. And our last panelist is Professor Kevin Spicer, who is the James J. Keanly Distinguished Professor of History at Stonehill College. Kevin Spicer's research centers on the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church and the German state under National Socialism. He's published numerous articles and several books, including Hitler's Priest, Catholic Clergy, and National Socialism. And the format of tonight's session is going to be David Kertzer will speak briefly about what motivated him to write this book and some of the key findings or discoveries that he had over the course of this project. And then each panelist, in the order in which I presented them, will speak for 12, 15, no more than 15 minutes, sort of talking about the book itself. David Kertzer will then have a brief moment to respond, and then we'll open it up to question and answer and discussion. And following the session, there is a reception outside, and everyone is welcome. And so please join me in welcoming David Kertzer to the podium.
Well, thanks to Rick Locke, who's made a huge difference here coming less than a year ago and really transforming the Watson Institute. But we're not going to talk about the Watson Institute. We're going to talk about an earlier period of time. I don't want to take much time. I did think when Rick suggested that perhaps it made sense for me to, in 5 minutes, give you a little idea of what the book is about, since most of you, I imagine, haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but then really reserve our time for our panelists. And I'm delighted that all 3 have agreed to be part of this and in their debt. The book focuses on these 2 men who, in most ways, couldn't be more different. Pius XI had spent his life really as a church librarian, scholarly, devout, studious, although he had a temper, but that's one similarity. But otherwise, Mussolini, much younger man, he was 39 when he came to power in 1922, of course, was this violent bully and had spent his life as an anti-cleric, most of his life as a left-wing socialist, of course, before making this transition around the time of the First World War to found his fascist movement. It's the period of the papacy of Pius XI. So Pius XI becomes Pope, Celerati was his name, becomes Pope in early 1922, dies in February 1939, that fateful year where later in the year the Nazi forces would march into Poland and kick off the Second World War. It's a time of great controversy among not only historians, but I'd say in general public. In Italy, one of the reasons I was interested in doing this book is I think there's quite a bit of amnesia, historical amnesia about the fascist period in Italy. I don't think Italy is alone in this, by the way, but talk about Italy at the moment. A denial, really, of the extent to which Italians were enthusiastic about Mussolini and the fascist regime. And the church certainly has been bitten by the same bug, as we'll talk about. So when I heard in 2002, it was announced by the then Pope, John Paul II, that he was authorizing the opening of the archives for this period, this papacy, I got quite excited. I thought that finally some of these controversies might be settled, or at least settled in the sense that we would feel we had good answers. Not that everyone would agree to the same narrative of this history. And it took 4 years till they were actually opened. They opened in 2006, not only Vatican archives, but other church archives for this period. I had a sabbatical, I think, in 2004-05, and I was able to begin working in the state archives, the fascist archives, which were already open for the period. And it's very important that you triangulate the documents, don't just look at one side or the other. So I spent time in both various fascist and state archives, time in various church, Vatican and other church archives like the Central Jesuit Archives, but also in various diplomatic archives outside Washington, in Paris, and then there's a whole series of published diplomatic correspondence from Germany, Britain, and elsewhere. So there's now a huge amount of material. It becomes a matter of really bringing it all together, thousands and thousands of documents, and bringing together documents that shed light on the same events from different sources. Now, controversy, one thing I was just looking at today, in fact, I think it was Kevin Madigan who alerted me to this. There's a publication, some of you may be familiar with, First Things. It's a conservative Catholic publication. It describes itself as America's most influential journal of religion and public life. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but anyway, it's influential in certain quarters. And the most recent issue has this article, Pious Against the Oppressors. And it begins, Pope Pius XI, fearless enemy of totalitarian ideologies and defender of Christian truth, died 75 years ago today. This was February 10th. A champion of humanity before the forces of oppression, he remains largely unjustly forgotten. And it goes on more in the same vein. What I found in doing this work is a much more complicated picture. I find Pius XI, or found him to be a tragic figure, so I certainly don't think I paint him as all good or certainly all evil. He basically came with a medieval vision that didn't prepare him for the political and social realities he was going to confront with the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazism. Okay, let me just give you a smattering of idea within 3 or 4 minutes of the kinds of things that are discussed in the book that I think are new. First of all, Mussolini came very close to falling in 1924. He came to power in 1922, the end of 1922, as a more or less legal prime minister in a multi-party parliamentary system. He'll only be in a position to establish his dictatorship, get rid of opposition press, opposition parties, and so on, beginning in 1925. In 1924, there's a murder of the leader of the Reformed Socialists in Parliament that led to a major rethinking on the part of his supporters, the conservative supporters, the conservative press in Italy. And we know from a wiretap phone call in the police archives, that Mussolini was certain he was about to fall. And what I find in my book, and the evidence for it is to be found in the book, is that absolutely crucial to his surviving unexpectedly was the role that the Pope played, which I won't go into here. In understanding this relationship between the Pope and Mussolini, another aspect of this history that had been largely unknown was the Pope had an emissary, not exactly secret, but a private emissary to Mussolini, who met with Mussolini one-on-one over 100 times in these years. Nobody else met this often with Mussolini one-on-one outside of his own inner circle in these years, nearly so frequently. He would shuttle monthly between the Pope and Mussolini, bringing the Pope's requests for action by the fascist authorities to benefit the church. So this is one of the major aspects of the book, is shedding light on this relationship. I also discovered that beginning in the mid-1920s, this envoy, who was a Jesuit, his name is Pietro Tacchi Venturi, began to try to convince Mussolini that there was an international Jewish conspiracy aimed jointly against the fascist regime and against the Roman Catholic Church. And so beginning over a dozen years before the first anti-Semitic laws would be announced in Italy, the Pope's envoy, by the way, without the Pope's knowledge, or certainly the Pope wasn't sending him to bring this message to Mussolini, kept hectoring Mussolini with the notion that he was under threat by the Jews and he better take action against them. Another finding in the book that I think sheds new light on this history is the extent to which, as the Pope, as I show in the book, beginning in the mid-1930s, begins to have doubts about Mussolini, or increasing doubts about Mussolini, the men around him, the high prelates around him, work furiously to keep him from doing anything that might break the profitable alliance between the Vatican and the Italian fascist regime. We tend to have, at least many of us have, ideas about popes who are all powerful, at least within the context of the church. And so to see how, for example, the Pope's remarks, which are critical of the impending war in Ethiopia in 1935, are taken by members of the Vatican Secretary of State office and butchered before they can appear the next day in the Vatican daily newspaper, so they contain no criticism of the war and no criticism of Mussolini. This was kind of eye-opening for me, and there are many other examples in the book of this sort of behavior that becomes more common as the Mussolini's embrace of Hitler becomes more and more pronounced. Also, you find in these newly opened archives evidence that the fascist regime relied on the Vatican Secretary of State office and its head, Eugenio Pacelli, a controversial figure who, of course, succeeds Pius XI and becomes Pope Pius XII. They rely on this office to help them internationally fend off action against the fascist regime and criticism of the fascist regime. And one good example, I think, comes from that war in Ethiopia. The League of Nations proclaims a boycott of Italy. Italy is isolated under economic threat. They're very worried the United States might join the boycott. The United States not a member of the League of Nations. And so the Mussolini uses the Pacelli and the Secretary of State Office of the Vatican to use its influence with the Roman Catholic clergy and the Italian-American community in the United States to prevent Congress from enacting legislation that would have joined the U.S. to the boycott. And I think I'm going on too long, so I won't give other examples except to mention that in terms of findings, there's an amazing document that's now come to light that's discussed in the book, which documents a deal made by this Jesuit envoy on the Pope's behalf with Mussolini weeks before the racial laws, the anti-Semitic racial laws are announced, which gives certain benefits to the church in exchange for the promise of silence on the part of the Pope and the church, the clergy, when the anti-Semitic laws are proclaimed. So hopefully that gave all too speedy, maybe incoherent idea of the nature of the book and what's in the book. So I look forward to our discussants' comments.
Good evening. I'd like to begin by thanking David Kertzer, the Watson Institute, Rick Locke, especially in Brown University, for inviting me tonight to help launch on his home campus Professor Kertzer's The Pope and Mussolini, just the latest historical tour de force by David, and allow me to say how privileged I am to share the panel with David, with Kevin, and with Susan. Now, I first encountered the narrative and historical genius of David Kertzer when about 12 years ago, on the recommendation, so it happens, of a Brown alumna, I read The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara as a graduate student. Your faculty has trained its alumni well to recognize a superior book. And to be truthful, the book brought tears to my eyes, and this, I must confess, was not merely because of the singularly affecting story of the abduction of young Edgardo and the subsequent agonies suffered by his desperate family. It was also, and more selfishly, because as I turned the last page of the book, I perceived that absent some remarkable advance in technology capable of transforming one's narrative and historical powers, I would never write anything so captivating, so gloriously told, and so impressively illuminating. This, I thought upon finishing, was exactly the kind of book I should have wanted to write when I grew up. But now a scholar of a certain age, I'm afraid I never will. Yet I feel tremendously privileged to have read this book by an historian, no less, that I found so spellbindingly written, an analysis that so skillfully merged microhistory, namely the story of a shocking kidnapping by the Inquisition, that immutable institution, of a single innocent and helpless boy and the endless tragic ordeal of the Mortara family, And the way that David used this micro-history to illustrate the sources of the historical tremors then trembling all through the Italian peninsula and indeed through most of Western Europe. So the way he merged micro-history and, if you like, macro-history, and I'm thinking, of course, when I say macro-history, of the movement of Italian reunification, of Risorgimento, the formation of a unified liberal state, the establishment of secular rule, the near eradication of temporal papal power, and the disintegration of the papal states, as well as the involvement of grandes like Pius IX, Napoleon, Cavour, and several of the Rothschilds. This is not even to mention the way in which David rivetingly tells us the story of how the story of Edgardo reverberated around the globe, or certainly around Europe, and became a cause célèbre in newspapers in much of the Western world. Like the books that David would write in the subsequent 15 years, this one was based on a breathtaking array of primary sources, including archival documents, legal records, newspapers, private correspondence. And it was all endowed with meaning and gravity, I thought, by David's peerless mix of anthropological and historical skills and training. In fact, I find many of these same qualities in the book we're celebrating and launching here this evening, which again focuses on a mesmerizing story, but as its subtitle suggests, again brings to bear a narrative, a gripping narrative of a single relationship, albeit this time of two very powerful men, to shed light on a much larger topic, namely the rise of fascism in 20th century Europe. Now, the first thing I notice about this book is that its footnotes of archival, primary and secondary sources and bibliography amounted to about 60,000 words, which is to say that the scholarly apparatus is a short book in and of itself. And David, I think that's taking deep and profound scholarship just a little too far. He's just embarrassing the rest of us now. But these include archival sources, which I will not now mention, as David has mentioned them. I can't. You should just look at the bibliography and be impressed. So let me just skip that part of my commentary, except to say that it's very, very impressive. Now, all of these sources together can be imagined as a colossal, multi-million word puzzle designed either to torment you or to take a lifetime to complete. David took 7 years, during some 5 of which I believe he moonlighted as a provost of a major Ivy League university. Now, it takes a prodigious research foundation to compose a book like The Pope and Mussolini, and only atop so nearly fathomless a foundation of learning can so grand and sweeping a narrative be set safely. I found upon finishing, and I'm sure Kevin and Susan will agree, that I could only stand in awe and salute the resolution and tirelessness of so tenacious a researcher and the immense erudition that made up a part, but an indispensable part, of this book. It's only with such learning that one is equipped to write against the grain of a widely accepted narrative, an authorial stratagem David has used to great effect in several of his books, as well as this one. In the Popes Against the Jews, for example, a favorite among right-wing Catholics, David begins with an analysis of We Remember, which is, as many of you know, the Holy See's 1998 statement on Catholic involvement in the Holocaust, which is another national and ecclesiastical myth, were I not in such distinguished company, I would characterize it as mealy-mouthed, but I won't say that in this setting. In any case, in attempting to exonerate the Vatican for racial anti-Semitism, and especially egregiously, in my view, lionizing the controversial wartime Pope, Pius XII, for imputing to him heroic deeds of which he could never rightly be accused, David very effectively counterpoises this narrative against the truth. And here in his latest book on the Pope and Mussolini, David writes against canonical Italian and Catholic memories as well. David's talked a little bit about some of these memories, so in the interest of time, I think I'll skip over that as well. But based on the superstructure of scholarship to which I've already referred, David, I think, remorselessly, in a good way, revises the approved narrative, which, though given the imprimatur of the Vatican, is unfortunately erroneous on nearly every point of the received narrative, of the narrative that the church resisted the anti-Semitic laws and so forth, the racial laws, rather. David launches an entirely successful campaign against, to borrow a phrase from Susan, the Italian and papal war against memory. Among David's conclusions are that the Vatican, far from resisting Mussolini, enabled and sustained the fascist regime. Several important Jesuits, including the Order Superior General, helped support the fascist regime and tried to muzzle papal criticism of Hitler. The envoy that David mentioned was the other Jesuit. And these Jesuits did much to sustain the balmy but profoundly harmful notion that there was a worldwide conspiracy, as David mentioned, of Judeo-Bolsheviks intent on subverting Christian society and establishing a communist empire in Italy. Not only did the church fail to resist the 1938 racial laws, church-approved writings actually provided the rationale for discriminating against Italy's tiny Jewish population. And among those who suppressed criticism of the Italian racial laws and kept tensions among Pius XI, who would grow suspicious eventually of the Chancellor of Germany, as well as Il Duce, and sought to ease tensions between the Pope, Mussolini, and Hitler, was the Cardinal Secretary of State Eugenio Puccelli, who would, as you all know, succeed the Pope as Pius XII. Now, most of all, the Pope and the dictator, who both came to power in 1922, depended on one another for mutual support and for achieving common goals. They shared many political ideas. Both loathed democracy and parliamentary democracy and communism. Each needed the other to achieve his totalistic agenda. Pius gave sacred legitimacy to Mussolini's fascist regime, and reciprocally, Mussolini, the one-time priest eater, restored many ecclesiastical prerogatives lost over the decades in the late 19th and early 20th century. Only near the end of his pontificate, enraged with Mussolini and Hitler, did the unholy alliance, begin to unravel. Now, needless to say, this is not a consoling narrative for those who treasure the traditional agenda. And consequently, we can be sure that the zealous core of papal apologists in the United States will accuse David of all manner of scholarly dereliction, not to mention anti-Catholicism and antipathy towards the popes. Yet those with the philological and scholarly credentials will, I think, more credibly conclude precisely the opposite. In fact, it's David's narrative that now must be considered canonical. Those who want to undermine this narrative, the Eagle Scouts of American Catholicism, we might call them, who know their popes and love them all. The only way in which this analogy fails is that Eagle Scouts are not habitually vicious and untruthful. These apologists will not only have to display their chest of papal medals to amaze us or to take our breath away or to concede their sanitized view of the past. The papal propagandists, and I use that term with all due respect, whose frightening impact on Catholic opinion stands in inverse relationship to their historical expertise, will have to cite chapter and verse in David's documentary Superstructure, or to show us how he has misread key documents. That they cannot succeed, lacking the requisite linguistic and historical training, in persuading us that Kertzer has erred, I can assure you, will not stop them, not prevent them, frankly, from appallingly nasty ideological and ad hominem broadsides. Amazingly, and you're going to think I'm making this up, but David can verify the story, there exists already one so-called anticipated review of David's book on the internet, whose author admits that he has not read David's book, nor that he plans to, but still issued a review of it in which he criticized it quite venomously. But David has received reviews like this before, and is quite likely inured to them. But regrettably, many Catholic readers will fail to recognize that such reviews do lack all credibility. In fact, one of the frustrations shared, I'm confident, by all of us on this stage tonight is the degree to which these papal apologists, and again, I don't mean this term pejoratively, but simply descriptively, have been allowed to get away with ad hominem onslaughts, obviously coordinated campaigns of denigration, and to put it simply, papal propaganda and historical revisionism, or denialism, to use the term of Australian commentator Paul O'Shea. As O'Shea has recently observed, it's time for these campaigns of disinformation and insult to stop. And it's frankly up to people like Kevin Spicer and me to stand up and put a stop to it. And let me just add, incidentally, that Kevin has already done valiant work, a good deal of valiant work in his unflinchingly courageous and honest reviews. Okay, enough pontificating from me about the papal apologist. Just a few more points. Like David's earlier books, this one reads very much like a novel. Though a 500-page book, it was a quick read, and this is, again, because of David's sense of the amusing and illustrative anecdote, the brilliant sense of compelling storylines, the skill at narrative pacing, and in this case, the wholly convincing presentation of fully rounded historical actors, or to use the language of fiction, characters, many of whom I regret to say are abominable clerics. I won't say anything more about them except that they fully credited and tried to persuade Mussolini, who initially did not credit it, of the existence of a worldwide Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy. Yet this book could never be considered an anti-Jesuit broadside, even though David does talk about the Jesuit pressure on Mussolini to believe these legenda. Among other things, David tells us the compelling narrative of an altogether admirable American Jesuit, John Lafarge, who had written a book on American racial injustice. And because Pius XI had read and so admired this book, and because of the growing sense latent in his pontificate of the incompatibility of Nazi racism with Catholic teaching, he commissioned Lafarge to compose an encyclical against racism, for him the famous hidden encyclical, of which many of you may know, but which until recently has not seen the light of day, owing to the untimely death of the Pope. My point is that the attention is given to the heroic and the honorable, as well as the shameful, although the latter, unfortunately, eclipses the former. In the interest of time, I think I'll skip. David, I guess the last thing I wanted to say is that David gives us lots of interesting new information about the future Pius XII as Cardinal Pacelli. I wondered as I read it whether this new material would make it into Pius XII's increasingly fat canonization dossier. But that's not very likely, I'm afraid. So let me bring my comments to a close. Now, all of these authorial qualities, the deep scholarship, the exposure and demolition of a canonical, comforting narrative, the courage to tell the unvarnished truth, the moral balance, the novelistic panache, the mass of new insight, the sure judgment, all make for a book that I, for one, do not hesitate to designate a masterpiece. Indeed, if this does not win a Pulitzer or a National Book Award, I suggest that there be an investigation. Perhaps beginning with the papal apologist, perhaps beginning with first things. Now, for this astounding accomplishment, we all owe David not only our admiration, but our gratitude. As an author, David is all of ours, and we celebrate him tonight as one of our nation's literary treasures, literary and historical treasures, as well as a good, decent, and moral man, as well as an intellectually generous one, as I've discovered to my personal benefit. Rick is absolutely right. I was trained as a medievalist, but David is helping me make a career change to being a modernist, and I'm very, very grateful to him for that. So he's all of ours, but he is, of course, in many ways, especially a treasure of Brown University, and thus he's yours in a special way. So let me just conclude by stating, with just a touch of envy, that you're extremely fortunate to have him. And so please join me in applauding this man from Providence.
So, yes, I too want to thank David and Rick and the Watson Institute for letting me participate on this panel. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing here. I do have this PhD in political science, but I do teach comparative literature, and I'm not an historian. But in any case, I mean, I know a little bit about fascism and about the debates around fascism, and I think that up until David's book, the way the critical approach to the relationship between okay. The sort of critical approach to the relationship between the Vatican and fascism has been usually by dividing the popes into the good cop and the bad cop, or the good pope and the bad pope, so that Pius XI remained the good pope, mostly on the force of what appears to have been his change of heart in his last years. And then Pius XII then was the one who also, of course, then his reign coincided then with the racial laws and with the war. So, but I think this book really undoes this in very often sort of shocking ways. Now, Kevin, number one, has alluded to the extraordinary sort of writing of the book, and it's a page turner, and it's really it's a wonderful read. I mean, a real tour de force, and yes, archive envy is. I mean, 25,000 pages of archive. One thing that David, you yourself didn't mention, it's that a lot of the work comes not simply from the Vatican, but also from the fascist police files. And I think this is really, really interesting. So what David did is he blended together these different sources, and out of that was able to create this narrative. And the reason why and how David used these is because the Vatican was deeply infiltrated by fascist police spies. And they were taking daily records, taking notes on what people were doing, what they were saying. They drew a very detailed picture of interrelations between people, character descriptions, and I believe also you were able on that basis to even transcribe some of the conversations that were going on, right? So that was really fascinating. Now, and so the portraits of the main protagonists are deep. They're very rich and extremely interesting. Obviously, the two main characters, Pius XI and Mussolini, but also Mussolini's Rasputin. I love that. That was the Jesuit Pietro Tacchi Venturi, who was referred to as the Rasputin. Now, one thing that comes out of these individual portraits is that the two men, the main Pius and Mussolini, are in some ways very different, but they're really important similarities, and you sort of end with that in your final author's note, where you talk about how they were things they had in common. They were tyrannical, both. I mean, they both had a very tyrannical character, and of course, one totalitarianism against the other. So when you have two totalitarianisms, obviously there's going to be a conflict. But they do seem to have shared this. Now, the other thing that one should say about this book is, and David already said it himself, is that because of the opening of the archives and I'm assuming also by reading these police reports, David was able to actually bring to light some important new, discoveries. And the most important, I believe, is the one that we learn about at the end, which is the secret deal that was struck between the Vatican and the regime regarding the racial laws that were passed in 1938. And so the deal was somewhat along the lines of that the Vatican would look the other way on the racial laws in exchange for that Mussolini would promise better treatment of Catholic organizations. So, I mean, that's more or less what the deal was. But I think the really, really surprising and shocking thing to me was that I mean, we know that the Vatican and the regime were working together on and they were collaborating in some sense. I mean, of course they were. And the 1929, the moment of the Lateran Pacts, right, when the Italian state and the Vatican recognized each other officially, and then therefore are able to open up diplomatic relations. So we know this, but. What really struck me was that Pius XI, and I think this is really, where he's not such a, not the good pope, was supporting the regime even when the Vatican didn't necessarily have its back up against the wall. That I found really interesting. So in other words, it was going much further than maybe even it had to. In other words, there were, it seems to me, various moments when the Vatican had the choice to do something else politically. And one of the instances, the first one, is the one that David referred to, which is the Matteotti crisis in 1924. Matteotti was a socialist deputy who was murdered after he gave a speech in which he criticized the regime. And this actually opened up the first of crisis for the regime, and it was a very, very serious crisis. It really looked like Mussolini's days were over, and the church moves in and gives tremendous amount of support to it, and it didn't have to. I mean, it could have simply sided with the conservative right because they were the people who were wavering, and decided to get rid of him, and they don't. So I find this very striking. A second instance is in around 1931. One issue that the Vatican and the regime were in conflict with repeatedly and over were the so-called Catholic action groups. These are youth organizations or designed to re-Christianize Italian society. That's what their goal was. And this was a battlefield between the Vatican and the fascist regime because, of course, the Mussolini wanted to be the one who was controlling and educating youth groups and not the church. So, here too, the Pope backs down in ways that I found very, very striking. And then the third, I think, example, and I think there are many, but a very jarring example was the Pope's position on the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. And here, too, support for the regime was eroding, particularly because of the sanctions placed on Italy by the League of Nations, and again the Pius XI and the Vatican supports. So I have I think two questions I would like to ask you, and the first one is an historical question, and what I'm wondering, because you begin the book with a very important fact, which is that there was, the Vatican was not part of the Italian political process, right, until the Lateran Pact, until 29, which doesn't mean that it was not acting politically, but not officially. And there was a party that was the Catholic Popular Party, right, under this guy named Don Sturzo. And so I guess my question is, why does Pius not back the Catholic Party? I just don't understand this, right? Why does it choose? In fact, this is one of the deals he makes with Mussolini, is to defang the party, Why does he make that choice? Why does he choose fascism when he could have, put himself behind a Catholic party and led it, down the path that he wanted it to go? So it's to me a very, very interesting problem. So why this choice for fascism? It's an active choice, right? And the destruction of his own Catholic party. So I think a related question to that is, what I am wondering, because you begin the book with a very, very important fact, which is that there was, the Vatican was not part of the Italian political process, right, until the Lateran Pact, until 29, which doesn't mean that it was not acting politically, but not officially. And the I'm thinking here about John Cornwell's Hitler's Pope, book, which you describe as problematic, right? Or, yeah. I mean, would you say that if you had to give a sort of similar title to your book, would you call it Pius's Dictator or Mussolini's Pope? I don't know. I'm just wondering, where you would go with that. I mean, you sort of stay with "and," so as opposed to the genitive. Yeah, I guess I think that's a question about the ultimate balance of powers between the two. Something. Okay, and now the second question, then I'll end there. I think is more of a methodological question. At a certain point in your book, you quote Pius XI's quoting the Italian writer Metastasio, and Metastasio, well, Pius XI says, quoting Metastasio, says, "There is no past, memory paints it," right? So I guess my question is, how do you deal with that problem in your book? In other words, if there is no past and it's painted by memory, then how do you deal with your sources? And I mean, for instance, I mean, at a certain point you say yourself, well, we have to remember that the fascist spy who's transcribing these discussions or is, describing how somebody is acting in the, we have to remember that this person may have an axe to grind, and we can, we don't know whether what he's describing is accurate or not. But you are basing your narrative on these, and so I guess the question is, how did you deal with that? And how did you choose to describe something in one way rather than the other? And then one little final thing is, the Italian translation is coming, the title is different, right? I mean, was that your choice? No. Were you against that? Okay, so it's called Il patto col diavolo, the pact with the devil. It's a very different kind of title. And, huh? Yeah, and then whose pact is that, right? And which, who's with whom? That maybe you can just tell us, what that means. But I'll stop here. Thanks.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be at Brown this evening as we celebrate the publication of Professor David Kertzer's The Pope and Mussolini. Professor Kertzer's work is a monumental achievement that will certainly alter the way we view Pope Pius IX's interaction with Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. This is especially true when Kertzer addresses the Vatican's response to the Italian racial laws. A controversial topic, Professor Kertzer nevertheless confronts it head-on and exposes the myopic concerns of the Church, its sacramental mission, and protection of its baptized members, including Catholics of Jewish heritage. Little, if any, concern was shown toward Italian Jews. This is not a major surprise because the history of Catholics and Jews in Europe is turbulent and deadly, filled with violence, torture, and murder. Professor Kertzer knows this well and detailed the last 200 years of this history in his 2001 seminal study, The Popes Against the Jews. Hatred, mistrust, and misunderstanding of Jews were not found only in the Vatican, the center of the Catholic Church, but in Catholic communities throughout Europe. Though most bishops and priests did not actively promote violence against Jews, they still routinely make comments that negatively mark them, often minimized by historians as anti-Judaism. Such statements regularly surface the ubiquitous deicide charge and placed an emphasis on Jews' rejection of Christ as Messianic Savior. Over centuries, Catholics' perennial labeling of Jews as Christ killers made this and similar charges seem firmly rooted in fact, and in turn invited additional attacks on Jews collectively. The Holy See did little to offer Catholics guidance to combat such a prejudicial characterization of Jews. This is what makes Professor Kertzer's work so pivotal. As Professor Kertzer points out, evidence of this fact is found in the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Offices, March 25, 1928, inconsistent pronouncement that both disbanded Amici Israel, translated Friends of Israel, a clerical organization which promoted understanding between Judaism and Catholicism and repudiated any hatred of the people once chosen by God. Despite the support of many leading churchmen for Amici Israel, certain officials within the Holy Office could not tolerate Amici Israel's request to reform the Good Friday supplication prayer that referred to Jews as perfidious. Such a change, they believe, might stir the church toward acknowledging the continued validity of the covenant between God and Israel, a point that most Catholics were unwilling to accept. The public document that disbanded Amici Israel did not abate the church's negative outlook on Jews, for as Professor Kertzer shows, subsequent statements by individuals associated directly with Pope Pius XI lessen the credibility of the Holy Office's condemnation of anti-Semitism. Pope Pius XI and the Holy Office charged Father Enrico Rosa, a Jesuit and editor of Civiltà Cattolica, with the task of explaining the Church's stance on anti-Semitism. Professor Kertzer notes that in the journal's May 1928 issue, Rosa presented two forms of anti-Semitism, an unacceptable form that was unchristian, racist, and hate-filled, and an acceptable form that monitored and offered a healthy evaluation of the danger emanating from the Jews to the society and the church. The Jesuit priest and theologian Gustav Grunlock offered a similar definition in his 1930 article on anti-Semitism, published in the influential and widely accessed Lexicon for Theology and Church. By the 1930s, whether or not a Catholic supported fascism or National Socialism was not the determining factor if she or he held views hostile to Jews. The majority of Catholics held prejudices in some form or another against Jews. Over the centuries, the process of vilification of Jews by church leaders had an impact on all Christians in Western society. Such language enabled Christians to view Jews as the other, Christ killers, who fundamentally were not to be trusted. History has demonstrated that there were clear social and political repercussions from such teaching: discrimination, ghettoization, expulsions, pogroms, and murder. At times, church leaders directly or indirectly encouraged the promulgation of edicts or laws enacted by Christian states and their Christian leaders against Jews. Ultimately, the last stop on this path of persecution and murder was the Holocaust. Professor Kertzer has detailed this history in his previous works and makes it ever so clear in The Pope and Mussolini. In the 1930s, when German Nazis and Italian fascists were severely restricting the rights of German and Italian Jews, the Church could not escape from its past history of anti-Semitism. Professor Kertzer points out that though church leaders found state laws treating Christians of Jewish heritage as Jews deeply troubling, their central priority always remained the protection of the Church and its interests. Kertzer also reveals that in August 1938, the Vatican, through its emissary, the Jesuit priest Pietro Tacchi-Venturi, and Mussolini worked out a deal whereby the Church's lay organization, Catholic Action, would be allowed to continue to function in exchange for the Vatican's agreement not to oppose the Italian racial laws. Still, Pius XI worried greatly about Italy's over-reliance on Germany, especially since National Socialist persecution of the Church was too blatant for the Pope to ignore. Pius XI became ever more critical in his public statements of German-Italian rapprochement and racial anti-Semitism. Yet, as Professor Kertzer shows, the pontiff's words still betrayed a clear anti-Jewish bias. Professor Kertzer confirms that the Catholic Church worked too readily to adjust itself to Europe's authoritarian dictatorships in exchange for protection of its salvific mission. Pius XI desperately yearned for a Christianized Europe, one free of the influence of non-Catholics, especially Jews. He was not unlike so many European Catholics of his time, who aggressively fought against what they perceived as the ills of modernity and pluralism. Though Pius XI recognized the evils of racial anti-Semitism, unfortunately, he did not live long enough to offer a significant challenge to it. Nor did his final address, composed but undelivered, an unconditional condemnation of, was it an unconditional condemnation of anti-Semitism and the authoritarian regimes that promoted it? It was not. As a result, the Church must now live with its pre-Vatican II legacy of appeasement, accommodation, and silence. In chronicling and analyzing this legacy, the results of which reflect the Church's own anti-Semitic conduct over the centuries, Professor Kertzer provides Christianity, especially the largest church of Christianity, a great step to self-knowledge, understanding, wisdom, and judgment. Such a step is an extraordinary step, indeed a giant step in scholarship for those who wish to grow in the truth and avoid being surprised ever again into accepting intolerance, bigotry, and prejudice. Thank you.
Get my water. I think I'll sit here. It's hard to take all that criticism and not lose your voice. So. Well, thanks, first of all, to all the panelists. I really appreciate the praise I've gotten from people I respect so much. Let me just quickly respond to a few of the questions that are raised and leave time for your questions and comments. Kevin Madigan mentioned the attacks that, the ad hominem attacks, which, for those of us who spent much of our career writing on perhaps less controversial subjects in terms of the general public, I mean, we're used to being criticized by scholars, but criticism by scholars in scholarly journals is one thing, and the kind of hate mail you get when you write on some of these other issues is something else. So I never, Kevin mentioned you develop a thick skin. I guess you develop a thicker skin, but one never gets quite that thick a skin. Whether my book will have any impact on the canonization dossier that you mentioned of Pius XII, I don't know, and I'm often asked that, what do I think about the effort to make a saint of Pius XII, and I always feel that puts me in an awkward position, not being Catholic, that I should be giving advice to the Catholic Church about whom to make saints, but I would say if
I'll give the advice.
Okay, I have some Catholic colleagues here. But I do think that if people read the book, it may be difficult for that to go forward, or at least without further bumps. Suzanne raised a number of questions. She highlighted the importance of the fascist police files, and I will say that this is a period of Vatican history for which we have much better sense of the kind of intrigue, backbiting, factionalism, and so on going on behind the scenes of the Vatican than we do for any other period of Vatican history. So what was bad for the Italians, namely the massive spy informant network, is good for the historian. Even when they open the archives, there's certain documents that are not made available. For example, the so-called personnel files are not made available. And so some of what we discover in the archives of fascist spies, you'll never discover as a scholar working in the Vatican archives. The question of why the Pope failed to back the Catholic Party, and I should just take a step back. In the same time, pretty much just a few months before the fascist movement is founded, a priest, Don Luigi Storzo from Sicily, founds a party called the Popular Party. And at the time Mussolini becomes prime minister in 1922, the Popular Party is, along with the Socialist Party, essentially the largest party in Italy in the parliament. He only has 35 members of parliament. Popular Party has over 100. And so from Mussolini's point of view, getting the church to withdraw its support from the Popular Party is absolutely central to his solidifying power. And part of the story of the first part of my book is exactly how that happens and why it happens. The Pope, Pius XI, the party had been established a couple of years earlier, or 3 years earlier, 1919, under a different pope, Benedict XV. And Pius XI was more skeptical of a party like the Popular Party. It was not under ecclesiastical control, and there was a whole segment of the church who thought this was a bad thing, and I think Pius XI was part of that segment of the church. Also, it was a progressive party. Basically, it was a party aimed at trying to wean peasants and working class Catholics away from the socialist movement, which was appealing to them in a major way at the time, with kind of progressive Catholic approach to social issues. And so it was a party that did not place the institutional interests of the church first and foremost. It put first and foremost what it took to be the interests of the less fortunate part of the Italian population. And what Mussolini promised to do is to take action, in part by not having to worry about getting a majority in parliament, to benefit the church. And the other part here, of course, of the story that's been implicit is the Italian state only came about in a war with the papacy, only through the destruction of the papal states, the last part of which was the invasion of Rome in 1870 and the annexation of Rome to Italy. The Pope, at the time, Pius IX, proclaiming himself a prisoner of the Vatican, excommunicating the king and so forth. So this is the background, a liberal state rejected by the church, which clung to the notion, among other things, of separation of church and state. Mussolini was willing, despite his anti-clerical background, despite not having a religious bone in his body, was willing to promise for his own purposes that he would restore many of the privileges of the church. And he did very early on. So the Pope did not see the Popular Party as providing that kind of benefit. So, that's a very short account. Of course, 11 years later, something somewhat comparable would happen in Germany with the Center Party, which has attracted a lot more attention. The previous chancellor, Kevin Spicer, knows a lot more about this than I do, in Germany was a member of the Catholic Center Party. And for Hitler, having the Center Party, which, unlike the Popular Party in Italy, had been around for decades, have the Center Party weakened was very important, and in fact dissolved in the first months of Hitler's reign. Anyway, well, that takes us a little bit off our subject. It is worth noting some parallels there. The title of so there are various questions about the title of my book, both in English and Italian. So should I have called it, Mussolini's Pope, to be like John Cornwell? Of course, John Cornwell was trying to be provocative, got him in a lot of trouble. It's misleading, certainly, as a title. Pope Pacelli, Pius XII, was not Hitler's Pope. He was not a Nazi and so on. He was acting in what he took to be the interests of the church in making the accommodations that he did with Nazism. I guess, one could, in some sense, call my book both Mussolini's Pope and the Pius's dictator. That you need to be equal about this. They worked out a deal, kind of realpolitik, and one of the things that is, in the book I discovered is exactly what it was that the Pope kept calling on Mussolini to use his dictatorial powers to do on behalf of the church. Mm-hmm. And here I would just take up something that Kevin Spicer mentioned when he said that the Pope had a view that Europe needed to become 100% Catholic and the authority structure of the church permeate all of Europe. I don't think it was the Jews that he was most concerned about, Pius XI, they were the Protestants. Mm-hmm. And in the book, one of the things that I think comes to light in these newly available archives is the extent to which Pius XI was consumed with a concern for the spread of Protestantism in Italy. And in the one and only meeting that he had with Mussolini, the first order of business he wanted to raise was the Protestant threat and the need for fascist police to take dramatic action against proselytizing Protestants in Italy. So, or to give another example that I mentioned in the book, but I think it's revealing, one of the things that's introduced is, in fascist Italy, is mandatory religious education in the public school. And the Pope finds out at a certain point that in Turin and Milan, permission has been given by the school authorities to allow the local rabbi to meet with the Jewish students during the hour of religion, to take the Jewish students to a separate room and teach them about Judaism. And in protesting through Cardinal Pacelli and demanding that this practice stop, the main reason given is that if you allow this, the next step will be allowing Protestant pastors into the public schools, and this could never be tolerated. So I think, actually, Pius XI was much more horrified by the idea of Protestant ministers in the schools than he was with rabbis in the schools, curiously. Let's see, I mean, what to believe in this evidence is obviously the main question anybody who's working on this history, or any history, but in some ways it's more dramatic perhaps in this very hotly contested history and emotionally fraught history that we have to face. And perhaps the informants from the Vatican are particularly problematic, but certainly not the only problematic source. Basically, all the sources are open to this kind of question. And this is why no history work is going to be final. Well, I'm sure other scholars will find more sources that shed light on some of the things I talk about, and there'll need to be new interpretations. It would just be nice if they actually found more evidence and didn't just ad hominem attack the author and claim it couldn't be true. But I'm sure this will turn out to be the case. I did, for certain things, for example, one of the things I discovered, I wasn't looking for, but discovered that became significant in a couple ways in the book are attempts to cover up sexual relationships that the high priest had, including issues of pedophilia. And, where you have, my feeling was, for me to believe secret police informants about this kind of charge, I would need a lot of different informants at different time on the same person describing similar behavior. And so the one case of the person who, in fact, this is one thing I am a little concerned about when the Italian edition comes out next month, that number of schools happen to be named for this person, but he was the cardinal deacon who actually puts the tiara on Pacelli's head to make him Pope Pius XII, a famous picture, had a trail of 15 years of pederasty accusations against him, also in police files, not just informants, but Italian police investigations. And Pius XI was well aware of this, and I'm sure Pacelli was as well. So, something like that that's very sensitive, but where, and there are many cases in these files where there'll be one accusation by someone of this sort, and I certainly would not reproduce that in the book. So that may be an extreme example, but the kind of thing that does come up here. And just finally, then perhaps we can open up the floor. Kevin Spicer, first of all, I'd like to thank him for his comments, and particularly appreciate Kevin is not only a very distinguished historian, but also a Catholic priest, and I think his courageous work from within the church is just something I'm in awe of myself, and it makes a huge difference. But I think the one question or the one point you made that I would take issue with is the question of Jews and Protestants, and it's an interesting one because a lot has been, of course, written about, and there's a lot of controversy about the Catholic Church and the Jews in this period. But I think it does help to put that controversy in light of the larger kind of counter-reformation, you could almost say, that still exists in this period. And I think we don't quite realize often the huge difference that the Second Vatican Council made to the Church. Second Vatican Council is under attack now. There are certainly conservatives within the Church who see this as one of the big mistakes made in modern Church history. But before this, there was a medieval vision, really, still in the 1920s, 30s, and in many ways up into the 1950s, where there was the one true church, and basically every other religion was doing the work of the devil, and working against God's true will. So it was just a huge difference that was made with the Second Vatican Council. And as we look back in this history, understand the relationship of the Church and the Jews, it's important to put that in this somewhat broader context of this sort. Thanks.